Malmedy, Belgium, 21st December 1944, 7:40 hours. Frost glazes the cobbles, and steam from a cafe kettle ghosts the window until the world is two colours, white breath and black iron. Private Frank Red Curry braces a two-piece M9A1 bazooka against his shoulder, while his loader, a farm kid with cracked knuckles, palms an M6A3 rocket and clears the backblast. A panther noses into the alley with a predator's low purr. The commander stands high in the cupola, trusting slope armour the way a diver trusts lungs. The magneto trigger clicks like a cricket, and the rocket hisses away, a yard-long needle trailing ozone. Impact is not thunder, but a hard metallic bark, the sound of a track flinching. The panther slews, one road wheel bitten, 45 tons suddenly clumsy, tilting into a stone horse trough. He reloads. The second rocket bites the exposed run of links. Not a kill, no glory plume through the turret. Yet it is the kind of wound tanks fear. Mobility gone, an animal that can't turn its head. Grenades tumble like thrown doorknobs. A half-track abandoned in the yard offers its machine gun. Red rips the butterfly trigger and scythes the opposite window where German infantry would have, in cleaner fields, stood with him. 5 Americans pinned behind barrels sprint free because one alley turned. Marie Delaunay, who would rather be pouring coffee, pulls a bandage tight on a boy whose teeth chatter louder than the gun. The cafe smells of apples and wood smoke and the faint sweetness of rocket exhaust. What happens here is documented: date, unit, weapon, result. Curry of K-120 infantry, 30 Division, forcing armour back and rescuing comrades. What follows repeated across the Ardennes because the villages taught an old lesson in a new language. Armour that ruled open country discovered that stone, hedges and second-storey windows rewrote the test. The bazooka was not a duelling pistol, it was a locksmith that opened the side door and let bigger guns finish the argument. When the smoke thins, Red tastes cordite and snow. The panther's engine coughs a last diesel syllable. From the cupola, a gloved hand rises, empty. Marie exhales as if she's been underwater and stares at the two-piece tube that looks like plumbing more than power. She will remember that shape longer than flags. It can bleed, she tells herself. Outside, the frost holds its shine, as if winter is waiting to see what the next alley will decide. The loader would later say he never felt the weight of the tube, only the weight of the silence after the second shot, when even the church bell seemed to wait for permission. In the record, it is a line. 1 Panther halted, 5 comrades freed. In the lives, it is the first time a boy from New York understood that a thing built in Ohio could reach across a continent and decide a European alley. Inside that thought, the battle pivoted, and none of them yet knew it. 3 days earlier, the maps at 1st US Army's Forward Command Post looked like an argument with fate. Grease pencil arrows, 6th Panzer Army in the north, 5th Panzer Army through the centre, sliced toward the Meuse. Fog promised the Germans 2 gifts: blind skies to silence Allied air, and a cloak for columns of Panthers, Panzer IVs, Stu Gs, and fuel trucks that would, if timetables held, put boots on the bridges in days. Against that plan lay a thin American screen. The 99th and 2nd Infantry Divisions on the North Shoulder, the 9th and 30th watching key roads and outlying cavalry and engineers plugging gaps with grit and wire. Separate the tanks from their infantry, a company commander briefed under blackout shades. Mines forward, 105 seconds ready for direct fire. Bazookas at the corners, don't box the cat, trip it. In the motor pool, Lieutenant Alan Macready, an ordnance officer who had been a plant engineer before the war, fought a different battle. Batteries for the old M1 A1s went dull in the cold. The newer M9 A1's magneto-igniters behaved better. He argued for the risky haul, crates of M6 rockets and spare tubes up to company dumps along hedgerow lanes. By doctrine, a rifle company's anti-tank section was not glamour. It was a pencil mark that either existed when a tank came around a wall or didn't. Macready signed for loads with a blunt pencil and told the convoy commander to take the hedgerow lane, not the main road where traffic jams would be targeted once daylight returned. His calculus was simple. A rocket at the right minute was worth a road of perfect planning 5 hours late. Men would have died for less math, and he refused to pay that price in blood. Night driving in the Ardennes demanded saintly patience and demonic resolve. Canvas snapped in the wind. Drivers cursed in accents from Ohio to Oklahoma, counting fence posts to avoid ditches. Engineers seeded crossroads with mines like metal seeds in an iron winter, and a corporal rehearsed his team on the M9A1's brake joint so they could carry it split and snap it together in a stairwell. Somewhere ahead, no one could say where precisely, was a boy who would need a tube at the exact minute his courage peaked. The fog thickened enough to make the world small. When the last truck backed against a beet pile behind a farmhouse and the first crate hit the ground, the convoy chief grinned with chapped lips. Somewhere beyond those fields, the arrows on the map were already bending. Thin lines can bend a long way before they break. With enough rockets, they sometimes harden instead. Macready logged the delivery and for once let himself believe that pencil marks could hold back steel. Bastonia's barns breathed frost. On the 20th to the 21st of December, the town's name had not yet become shorthand, only another place where roads braided and men in overcoats argued with maps. The 101st Airborne dug in along hedgerows and garden walls, while attached tank destroyers unlimbered in back streets, muzzles depressed for alley work. A Stugie's snout appeared between two brick houses, like a boar pushing a gate. In open terrain, its low silhouette and 75mm gun would have been terrifying. Here it was an intruder in a stone maze built for feet, not tracks. The drill was doctrine and experience braided. Let armour creep past the obstacle belt, cut its infantry escort with machine guns and rifle fire, then punish the exposed sides. Bazooka teams took the doors opposite one another. If one fired, the other would have seconds to adjust for the crew's frantic pivot. Marie Delaunay, whose café faced a crossroads, turned her cellar into a triage corner. She learned to hear differences no manual taught. The bell-like clang of a ricochet on glacis, the duller, hungry thud of a side hit on skirts. North on the Elsenborn shoulder, the 99th and 2nd Divisions wrestled the same lesson from frozen earth. A panther that could outrun respect in fields found itself reduced to a geometry problem at 30 yards. Typical side armour on a panther ran about 40 to 50 millimetres. The M6A3's shaped charge, properly placed, could bite deeper than that number suggested, because chemistry ignores pride. In practice, many bazooka shots produced mobility kills, broken tracks, bent idlers that invited artillery or tank destroyers to finish the work once the beast stopped moving. Here is a number that still sounds impossible. By war's end, America produced roughly 60,973 tanks, while Germany built about 19,926. In December's alleys, that arithmetic was not a brag. It was a tone of voice. The men on both sides did not count factories in the moment, yet abundance shows itself as confidence in taking a second shot without fear of the last. A company could afford to discard a suspect rocket and still fight lavishly. When darkness came early and snow glazed the lane, a panther idled where two doors faced each other across an alley. One door coughed a rocket, the other waited for the panic traverse. Inside Marie's cellar, a medic whispered, "Hold on," to a boy from Kansas while boots hammered past overhead. Outside, the tank's engine note rose, then stumbled. The village, which had two doors for every house, decided who would pass through them alive. South of town, the same grammar unfolded at a crossroads barn. A Sherman clanked into view, not as saviour, but as partner. Its 75 fanning a hedge while a bazooka team slid along a wall to worry a panzer's track. The combination mattered. US doctrine did not worship any single tool. It married tools until problems broke. In the snow-hard quiet between shots, even the Germans could hear the method becoming muscle memory. Dawn tasted like iron filings. Red traced a panther's outline with a gloved finger on a frosted pane, circling the idler, the sprocket, the rear hull plate. The squad gathered close, the loader's breath making a halo around his scarf. "Don't duel the nose," the sergeant said, tapping the glass. "Bite the hip. If you can't see the hip, make him show it." Doctrine sounded like common sense once you had heard tracks scuff stone within reach of your heartbeat. The M9A1's two-piece tube was clumsy in farmhouse stairwells, but it travelled well broken down and snapped true when assembled. They rehearsed what the manuals wrote in sterile sentences. Backblast would blind and burn in small rooms, so the gunner stood in a doorway or knocked a brick loose to make a vent. A good loader was a priest and a drummer. Hand the round, clear the tail, slap the tube, count the beat until the whoosh. Under stress, a reload ran 4 to 6 seconds. In the life between rockets, riflemen covered windows and alleys with BAR and Garand fire. The aim was not to prove nerve, it was to create a geometry the tank couldn't like. Across the line, Oberscharführer Karl Weger had his own briefings. Buttoned up, vision shrank to slits. In clean country, that was discipline. In stone villages, it was like driving a cathedral down a hallway. He marked houses with chalk where he believed rockets had launched, pushed his hull against walls to protect flanks, and ordered infantry to ride the deck, until fire drove them off and he was alone again, the condition every tanker dreads. He told his driver to pivot at smoke, then freeze when the alley narrowed. Lieutenant Macready, hearing reports of cold, stiffened fuses and cracked batteries, chose speed over thrift. He had crates pulled from a suspect lot and replaced without ceremony. In a different army, that would have been a scandal. In this one, it was Tuesday. Waste was policy shaped by production that could be impatient. The weapon's reliability rose not because the tube became perfect, but because failure no longer slowed the story. He also learned what panic did to traverse motors and what frost did to hands. Tanks were perfect until they touched the world. Villages were all world. The detail would have bored a staff briefing yet decided lives. Cobbles slick with meltwater stole braking distance. A shallow ditch stole a degree of gun depression. A low garden wall hid a loader's elbow as surely as armour hid a heart. The men started calling angles by nicknames, as if familiarity could make courage reproducible. When the next alley demanded proof, Red slid the tube into a doorway, the loader's mittened hand steady at his elbow. The tank appeared, not heroic, large and late, and the squad's breath shortened in unison. The trigger clicked, the rocket hissed, and before impact everyone held their name in their mouths like a coin. Elsenborn's twin villages held their breath under a skin of ice. The 99th Infantry Division, green by reputation but hard by circumstance, dug in where stone fences cross-hatched lanes into killing geometry. A good ambush was a list. Telemines beneath drifted snow, wire to funnel, machine gun sectors like fan blades, a bazooka blind behind a walled garden. The platoon sergeant walked the line, heel tapping each obstacle as if tuning a piano. "Remember," he told Red's team, "it's the second shot that counts. The first teaches them where not to look." When the Panthers came, they came with infantry clinging to engine decks, boots slipping on frost-slick armour. In theory, that escort solved the village problem. In practice, bar bursts and rifle volleys scraped them off like burrs, and the tanks rolled on alone, buttoned against a world whispering threats through keyholes. A Panzer IV, less proud than a Panther but no less dangerous, eased past a garden gate and paused to choose a path. Red waited for the traverse, aimed not at the turret but the road wheel, and squeezed. The hit rang like a bell struck under snow. Marie moved between cellar and street with an apron she refused to remove, as if dignity itself were a uniform. She learned to ration morphine as carefully as flour. When a wounded German boy grabbed her wrist in panic, she said in French, then in halting German, "You will live if you lie still," which was true, and not always true. The cafe windows carried frost like lace, and behind them she kept kettles going for whichever uniforms held the corner that hour. By mid-afternoon, the platoon had broken 3 pushes. The bazooka team, gunner, loader, and a third man to cover rear and resupply, cycled through doorways like stage hands between scenes. Smoke from wet logs and powder lay low, making the village taste like coins and wet newspaper. The sergeant noted that rocket stocks were thinning and sent a runner. Behind the lines, Macready had already diverted an extra truck to the company dump, calculating that the evening freeze would make the hill impassable by midnight. Oberscharführer Vega, 2 streets over, felt the battlefield shrinking around him. The world reduced to a slit view and a rack of ready rounds. He told himself that once he cleared the village, the old truths would return: speed, range, open flank shots of his own. The driver edged forward. The radio crackled with reports of stalled comrades. A rifle grenade burst against the turret ring, nothing but noise, but it sounded like prophecy. Dusk iced the rooftops. The village exhaled, then held its breath again, knowing night would argue the same points with the same grammar. Lieutenant Macready worked in a canvas-topped trailer that sweated at noon and froze by dusk. He licked a stub pencil and turned the day into columns. Rockets issued, tubes replaced, misfires reported, convoys turned back by jackknifed trucks, convoys that ghosted through on second try. Numbers had a smell too: diesel, wet canvas, men who hadn't slept. He added a line in the margin for cold. Temperatures shaved reliability from everything, so he issued 2 extra per team as insurance. Waste made sense when the schedule could afford it. Radio traffic murmured from a set on the crate beside him. Bastogne reported tanks inside the perimeter, then tanks burning. The north shoulder held, though every message sounded as if it had been dragged through sand. Macready compared his tallies to intelligence notes on German fuel. He was honest with himself. The numbers weren't apples and apples. Yet the contour was plain. A single American infantry division, fighting hot for a week, would have consumed rocket tonnage that equalled, or in some sectors outweighed, the petrol available to a German Kampfgruppe trying to sprint. Here is the statistic that breaks modern ears. At Willow Run, the Ford plant learned to complete a B-24 Liberator at peak pace in roughly 63 minutes, an airplane an hour. The line was not constant across the war, and bottlenecks never fully disappeared, but the direction of travel was decisive. A democracy taught itself to make thunder on a schedule. When Macready signed a form to discard a suspect lot of fuses and issue fresh, he was spending that miracle like pocket change, trading minutes now for lives not lost later. From the front came the poetry of small victories. "Mobility kill," an artillery liaison reported, matter of fact. Crew dismounted. Red's platoon listed 2 rockets expended for 1 tank stalled and subsequently destroyed by a 105 in direct fire. That was the choreography. The tube made the statue wobble, the gun pushed it over. On the ledger, it read like grocery math. In the alley, it tasted like iron and cold, and fear relaxed by 10 pounds. Snow began again, thick flakes that made the trailer quiet. Macready closed his book, then reopened it and drew a box around the truth he trusted more than ink. Abundance equals time. Time lets you move reserves. Time invites clear weather. Time crushes offensives. He jotted another comparison in the margin that he would never brief to a general, but would remember years later when he heard the word miracle used carelessly. German armoured fighting vehicle write-offs in this campaign alone would run to more than 500 machines, while the United States could replace a battalion's worth of tubes and rockets overnight without anyone in Detroit working a longer shift. Time, he underlined again, is the most American caliber. Christmas Eve arrived with a ceiling so sharp it felt planed by a carpenter's hand. The fog that had sheltered columns turned brittle and blue, and contrails stitched new lines across the Ardennes. Red heard the first fighter bombers before he saw them, a knitting needle whine that grew into the steady hammer of ordnance on road knots he had tiptoed past in the dark. Yet the village did not become safer. It became clearer. With the sky open, the work at ground level tightened, the alleys demanding their familiar grammar, separate, flank, finish, while the air drew hard brackets around German timetables. Vega's Panther, low on petrol by mid-morning, limped into a farmyard with a track that had been slapped once too often. Doctrine said, hold for recovery. Reality said there was no fuel, no time, no infantry left to ride the deck. He sent his driver to nose the machine against a wall, masking the soft side, then called for the can of gasoline that lived like an admission of defeat in every turret bustle. A controlled burn denied an enemy a trophy. Flames licked up with a softness that never felt right against iron. He watched the turret bloom and understood that clever men at desks had been right about speed and surprise, and wrong about everything that comes after you turn into a Belgian street. Marie saw the smoke and did what civilians always do when rules evaporate. She moved toward the hurt. A teenager in Feldgrau stumbled out of a gate, one sleeve ablaze, eyes blown wide by heat and shame. She threw him into the mud and smothered the fire with her apron, cursing him, then forgiving him, then cursing herself for choosing too. Red's squad, filtering past the lane, paused just long enough to make the choice easier by not making it at all. Let him breathe, the sergeant said. We're hunting the rest. Air power made the roads murderous. Bazookas made the corners so. An armoured car knocked a gate post loose and died to a rocket through the side slit. A half-track, abandoned, became an impromptu firing platform once its gun could be persuaded to speak English. The weather had flipped the chapter, but the narrative line remained the same. Tanks that outran fear in open country were now timed by alleys and men who knew how to read them. By dusk, the town wore scorched patches like a moth-eaten coat. The sky kept its colour well into evening, a blue that felt more American than any flag, because it was the colour of schedules kept and convoys arriving. Red counted tubes left and rockets spent with the guilt of a man who had been given 3 of something precious and used all 3. Far down the road, a stick of bombs walked across a crossroads the platoon would have, at dawn, tried to cross. He whispered thanks to whatever God managed ledgers and weather, and the cold held him like a promise that the worst had tipped. The barn floor became a chalkboard. Separate, flank finish. The letters looked like a schoolhouse lesson, and in a republic they were. Red's platoon rotated bazooka pairs the way a factory rotates stations, gunner and loader leapfrogging doorways, while a third man, today Hull, tomorrow Ortiz, watched the back and shoved fresh rockets into cold hands. It would have seemed theatrical if it weren't so necessary. One team fires, the other waits for panic traverse, someone always counting the beat between whoosh and impact. There was no talk of bravery after the first week. There was only talk of spacing, angles, and the quiet miracle of having enough rockets to try again when wind or nerves or luck made the first round go wild. The tube itself taught its own manners. Backblast, scoured plaster from farmhouse walls. A straight-through shot from a doorway ran cleaner than a room where smoke had nowhere to go. The M9A1's magneto didn't care about frozen batteries, but stiff fingers still fumbled the connector until muscle memory took over. Under stress, a 4-second reload grew into 6. On the third alley of the day, the hands found their economy again. A sergeant's correction, a hair higher read, "We're not knitting socks," landed like affection. Everyone was tired enough to accept being made better. On the far side of the line, Vega rode in a borrowed Panzer IV that felt like a concession. He lectured himself that a tool is a tool, that the gun is a gun, even if the nameplate is humbler. The crew was new to him, the loader left-handed, the driver jumpy. He ordered a pivot at the first hint of smoke, then ordered no pivot when the second rocket came from the other door. He could feel his own doctrine eroding, one alley at a time. There is a point where an army stops believing in its nouns and clings to its verbs: move, shoot, burn. He did not say the last one aloud. Lieutenant Macready improvised sleds from door planks and telephone wire to drag crates across drifts up to a company dump that had relocated itself by necessity. A little red ball inside the bigger war, he joked to a driver who had forgotten how to smile. He signed a slip that allowed a platoon to overdraw its rocket allotment for the day and thought about how many signatures like his stitched the front together. The order was simple to write because somewhere people he would never meet had done the math and decided he could afford to be generous. By nightfall, the chalk words on the floor had been scuffed by boots into a cloud, the way doctrine is scuffed by use until only the meaning sticks. Red coiled the firing wire with hands that could still do small tasks. "Same plan tomorrow," the lieutenant said. No one cheered, they nodded, and that was better. A method you can repeat is worth more than a miracle you cannot. Marie learned to keep a bar of GEI chocolate by the stove, not for sweetness, but for triage. A child crying could drown orders. A square of sugar quieted better than a shush. She broke a piece for a boy with a snot-glossed lip, then tucked the wrapper into her apron pocket and found, later, a typewritten cipher on the back, a resupply time and a route scribbled by the ordnance lieutenant who had borrowed her table to steady his clipboard. The war had a way of leaving messages for those who cleaned up after it. She pinned the scrap to a rafter, a prayer the convoy would make it. Red's squad moved through rooms that had been other lives a week earlier. A sewing machine on a table, a Madonna on a shelf, a jar of nails beside a pile of apples shrunken by the cold. He felt like a burglar with permission. The loader, today it was Ortiz, kept count like a miser. 2 left in the satchel, 3 in the crate at the back stair, 6 promised at dusk if the sleds beat the new snow. He would have hoarded if the need hadn't argued otherwise. They spent rockets like men spend breath, without drama, and only notice the absence. Vega found himself reading a captured American field order with an awe that felt like betrayal. Misfire rates were anticipated, over-issue buffers were policy. Entire pallets could be scrapped on a platoon leader's say-so if time was the prize. He tried to imagine a staff that would write such authority down and then actually hand it to strangers. The idea felt as alien as a warm bed. He thought of the burned panther and tasted rust. Here is a number that sounds impossible until you stand under a sky like the one that returned after the fog. The United States built roughly 297,000 aircraft during the war. That number does not belong in a village, but it lived above every village. It meant schedules that could be kept, replacements that could be promised without lying, escorts for bombers that arrived when briefed, and the confidence that if you used a rocket badly today, someone would bring you 2 more tomorrow so you could use them well. Marie poured coffee for Americans in muddy overshoes and for Germans with bandaged hands, depending on the hour. She marked her boards with chalk so no one's pain was lost between shifts. The chocolate wrapper on the rafter fluttered when the door opened. She began to think of it as a weather vane, pointing toward whichever army would hold the lane at dusk. "Keep the door cracked when you fire," she told Red, because the cafe had become a school, and sometimes civilians learn faster than soldiers. He grinned like a boy about to be scolded and promised to mind the backblast. At the edge of hearing, engines muttered along the resupply route the cipher described. She felt the sound in her teeth and hoped the arithmetic of abundance would hold through the night. After-action boards went up in a schoolhouse that still smelled faintly of chalk and ink. Kills, mobility kills, abandonments, artillery assists. The words looked arrogant until you read the footnotes, which confessed the truth professionals always knew. Most tanks died twice. First, when a bazooka made them halt. Second, when a gun or a charge or a crewman's match made the halt permanent. The tally was not an indictment of any weapon. It was a portrait of a method. Red stood at the back, cap in his hands, and searched the columns not for victories but for names of the rescued. Records, like rockets, were tools. They were not the thing they contained. The staff officer with the pointer tapped casualty figures as if they were assumed knowledge. American losses in the Ardennes on the order of 75 to 81,000. German casualties 80 to 100,000. Civilians counted in their thousands by villages that had learned to count only after the ground stopped shaking. Armour write-offs on the German side, depending on whose ledger you respected, ran beyond 500 fighting vehicles. The officer's voice lacked thunder. Numbers this size speak in a monotone that survives celebrations and excuses. Vega, a prisoner by now with a bandage that made his face feel lopsided, sat on a bench near the stove. He listened without the convenience of disbelief. He had seen too many burned-out hulks to argue the arithmetic. He thought of the houses where rockets had coughed from opposite doors, of how quickly his turret's traverse would outrun his eyes, and of how little his faith in frontal armour had mattered when a boy cut the track at a yard he could have paced in 3 steps. He had imagined the war as a duel of machines. The board suggested it had been a duel of procedures, with machines as arguments, not gods. A war can pivot on a sentence as easily as a shell. Bazookas immobilized, guns finished, the briefer said, and somewhere a lieutenant revised his training talk in permanent ink. In a corner, Macready added his own translation. Abundance buys patience, patience buys angles, angles buy kills. He knew it was not poetry, but it felt closer to truth than any slogan. He thought again of the plant where he'd watched wings crawl on a chain and counted rivets until numbers had become a sense-like touch. Red stepped outside when the stove's heat became too much. The air snapped his lungs awake. Across the square, a panther's burned carcass hunched like a blackened haystack. Kids had already climbed it. One tapped the track with a stick, listening for a note only children and mechanics can hear. Red wasn't superstitious, but he touched the 2-piece tube leaning by the door as if it were a talisman. Not for luck, for gratitude. It had done its part. So had the men who carried it to him in snow. Macready walked the forward dump with a clipboard and an eye that had become miserly about time, not things. Spent tubes stacked like stovepipes. Crates broken open by men in gloves who didn't have the patience for nails when minutes were lives. A pile of captured jerry cans turned into stoves that made coffee feel like a strategy. He penciled notes that would become policy for someone else. Pre-position winterized fuses. Push magneto spare kits. Allow overdraw when temperatures drop below a number the book had not specified. He did not write the reason column that lived in his head. Tonight's waste buys tomorrow's survivors. Marie attended a small burial behind the church while artillery fumbling in the distance sounded like a tired god tapping a spoon. A chaplain's voice wove between languages. A GI set 2 chocolate bars on a helmet as if balancing a scale. 1 for the boy beneath, 1 for the child who would live. She thought of the wrappers as letters home that would never be posted. When she returned to the cafe, she polished the espresso machine, although there was no pressure, no beans, nothing but habit. Dignity was also a ration. Vega reached the place where captured men become paperwork. A clerk asked questions without cruelty. Unit, vehicle, where lost. He answered with the economy of a man who knew details had become safer than silence. He surprised himself by saying, when asked what had broken his confidence, they were everywhere. Not the tanks, he could dual tanks. The tubes. In doorways, cellars, second stories, garden walls. The clerk wrote bazooka ambushes in a small hand, and did not add his own opinion about systems that place power in small hands and then keep them supplied. Here is a quiet arithmetic Macready carried back to the trailer. The minutes saved by discarding a suspect pallet could translate conservatively into yards taken before dark. Yards taken before dark into a field of fire adjusted at dawn. A field adjusted at dawn into one more tank halted at 20 yards instead of 10. He could show the chain on paper, but he preferred to feel it when a platoon sergeant came in at noon and said, sheepish and proud, "Sir, we burned every round you sent and lived to ask for more." The request felt like a benediction and a dare. Night pulled its blanket tight. The dump fell into silhouettes. Inventory tags fluttered from empty pallets like prayer flags. Macready signed one more overdraw chit and allowed himself a private ritual. He touched the corner of the form as if it were the shoulder of a man just sent back to the line. Then he closed the ledger and stepped outside to the sound that mattered most. The low, stubborn mutter of engines working uphill toward men who had not yet learned they would live. Spring would have, in time, softened the edges of Bastogne and Malmedy, but winter held a while longer, just enough for men to notice that fence posts had been made from panther track. Red returned his tube to a depot that smelled of oil and mud and the metallic breath of machines cooling after a hard day. The quartermaster stamped the card without ceremony. There was already a stack of replacements heading out because the war's calendar still had weeks to run. From the 16th of December to the 25th of January, the great counterstroke had risen and broken, first on alleys, then under clear air, and its foam was burned tanks and abandoned plans. Vega, a number now, walked past vehicles that would never move again and did not try to count them. He had learned that some arithmetic undoes a man. He listened to guards talk about home with a casualness he envied, about fields and streets with names that sounded like reasons. He had thought tradition would carry the day, that steel and courage came crowned by destiny. The villages had taught a different civics lesson. A free people's factories make promises that their soldiers can keep. Marie's cafe reopened one morning, not because coffee had returned, but because dawn had, and she believed in beginnings. She righted chairs, hung a clean cloth, and set the rescued Madonna back on her shelf. Chocolate wrappers became bookmarks in a ledger she kept for herself, a list of names she would likely never see again, American and German, each with a note of thanks she could not deliver. She had learned that abundance could be measured by gifts given to strangers, a cup, a blanket, a bar, a minute. Macready closed his last trailer ledger with a thumbprint of grease that looked like a signature. He wrote a note for the next man. Logistics is maneuver by other means. Spend minutes like ammunition. Trust the factories. Detroit, Willow Run, Pittsburgh, places with names that sounded like brigades. He allowed himself one impossible statistic to carry home like a medal pinned inside a coat. American shipyards had launched over 2,700 Liberty ships in the war, a fleet from scratch, a promise built into water. Numbers like that changed what commanders dared to order and what boys dared to attempt at 40 yards. The reckoning did not need drum rolls. Casualties had been counted. German armoured fighting vehicle write-offs in this winter fight alone climbed beyond 500. The US inventory of tanks, about 60,973 across the war, would not swagger past a grave. It would stand at attention and admit its purpose, to let more men come home than otherwise would have. Red walked a lane lined with track-link fences and touched the cold iron as if it were a rail tied back to the lathe that shaped it. From the lathe to the lane, the trigger had been long, and many hands had pulled it. In that span, a nation had told the world what it could build and what it would not break.